Welcome to the What's Under the Hood podcast. And my name is Rick Maltese. I'm the host. And I have with me Chris Adlam, Jaro Franta, and Tom Hess. And we're all going to be discussing the CANDU in general, and perhaps more specifically about Pickering. But we can sort of skip around and talk about even the decommissioned ones if you want. Okay, so yeah, just to get started, let's get some people's background. I wanted Jaro to start explaining his background first.
I retired from AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, in August 2011. So that's 12 years ago. And so I worked, originally I started with AECL in Chalk River in Ontario. And then I found out that they have an office in Quebec, in Montreal, which is where I normally live. So I transferred to the Montreal office. That was after I also worked for a short time at Pickering on the refurb project there. But once I was in the Montreal office, I worked mostly on the Gentilly 2 CANDU plant, various aspects of that. Gentilly 2 is situated across the St. Lawrence River from Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers. But we also had other projects for Chalk River and elsewhere. Also the advanced CANDU. Basically, what happens is in the Montreal office, we got all sorts of stuff that none of the other AECL offices wanted to do. Okay, we can discuss some of that if you like later.
Okay, yeah. How about you, Chris?
Well, I actually work in the IT industry, in healthcare specifically. I got interested in nuclear power when the GEA started messing up rates in Ontario and was being blamed on nuclear, and I did some deep diving into that and realized that was complete nonsense. In terms of an engineering background, my grandfather was an engineer in hydroelectric at GE here in Peterborough, as was his father, Hubert Sills, who had a ton of patents in various hydroelectric stuff and participated in many of our massive hydro build-outs here, both in Ontario and Quebec and abroad.
Okay, yeah. And Tom, what do you want to say?
Oh, hello. Well, as Rick mentioned, the name is Tom Hess, and I work in the electricity industry, or used to. Actually, I still do some contracting work right now. But I started with Ontario Hydro back in 1975. At the time, I lived in Cambridge, Ontario, and started moving around the province as an operator. Started off in Hamilton, worked in Toronto, up to North Bay, over to London, Ontario, and then back to Toronto. So I've got hands-on experience with distribution system equipment, just the poles and wires that you have around the streets, and then the high voltage equipment. So the big transmission towers crisscross the province. When I worked in North Bay, I had hands-on experience operating hydroelectric plants, both small, old, and large, new. And from London, then I was a traveling operator there. In 1980, I started working in the Ontario Hydro System Control Center. So basically a grid operator.
Okay.
And that involved everything at that time. Of course, Ontario Hydro was vertically integrated, so you did everything from operating the transmission system to planning river system water flows and directing the generation up and down, doing the balancing, doing sales and purchases with other interconnections and that sort of stuff.
Do most grid operators like nuclear power?
Well, they love it.
Oh, good to know.
It's like the cruise control on your car. You set it and forget it. Right? It takes care of so much of the demand. Just sits there, generating power nonstop. And I know people try to make fun of it. Oh, is it really 365, 24/7? Because every so often the equipment fails and the unit goes off. And then you get the people saying, well, it's not really dispatchable and it's not there 365 days a year, but it is. That's the intent of it. Actually, they try to have it there for 3 years at a time. And one of our generators managed to do that a while ago.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a really good power source. I grew to love it when I worked at the control center. I went to Ontario Hydro straight out of high school, and all my knowledge is basically on at-work experience. I'm probably just as good as an engineer, if not better.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Because we had to apply everything that they came up with and morph it to actually what worked on the system and actually spot problems and deficiencies in what they provided us. So it's an all well-rounded experience base.
Okay.
My certification was a certified grid operator in the reliability field. So that was a NERC certification. So we were certified, but that was more or less my post-secondary education.
So I want to get down to this, talking about the CANDU, and I just wanted to read something because I liked this comment, and it talks about the power behind reactors in general, and I think the CANDU, of course, belongs in that category. This was a guy called Colin Tucker, and he wrote a book called How to Drive a Nuclear Reactor. And he says, if you're driving a modern PWR at steady output, you'll have as much power at your fingertips as 40 fully laden 747 aircraft taking off simultaneously. And I thought that was pretty amazing to demonstrate what kind of power is conducted by these reactors at one time. And I guess that would be a combination of reactors, that kind of power. It wouldn't be just one reactor, right?
I think a jet engine might be something on the order of 10 megawatts thermal. So if you have a CANDU, which is, let's say, 700 megawatts electric, which is what, 2,500 thermal, you're talking about an awful lot of jet engines.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So that must have been one then. You're right. That sounds like it's just one reactor.
Yeah, I just did the old quick Google here, and 1 megawatt is 1,341 horsepower. And you can roughly double horsepower to be pounds of thrust. So, yeah, if you want a reactor.
Okay. And I thought that was, I mean, also the other weird thing that totally struck me is how much water actually runs through a reactor in a given second. How it's just enormous. People don't realize the kind of transfer of water that needed for cooling and other reasons. But
transport, yeah, it's massive. I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but they tell you when you're doing the Bruce tour, and of course that's from 4 units.
Yeah.
And it's insane, but it's only a 3 degrees temperature rise. So one of the reasons of moving that volume of water is to keep the temperature rise down. So the inlet water and the outlet water, there's only roughly 3 degrees Celsius difference between the two.
Yeah, that is very small. You wouldn't expect that. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason that Bruce Power does that, try to keep the temperature difference so small, is because they have an environmental issue with fish in Lake Huron, and they want to make sure that the local temperature, does not interfere with the breeding of the fish stocks in the lake. And this has been a subject that was covered numerous times in CNSC hearings, that is public hearings of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission.
And with regard to how a nuclear reactor works, they always talk about moderators, and I think it's worth discussing what are the moderators on a CANDU.
It's deuterium, it's heavy water.
Right. It's the water itself, right? But it's not just ordinary water.
No, it's heavy water.
And that's
an extra hydrogen.
How do you make deuterium?
You uprate regular water. It's kind of like a distillery. We had a massive deuterium complex located at Bruce. Tom informed me it was originally fired by fossil fuels, which is something I didn't know. The Bruce heavy water plants later on were powered by the process steam that came out of Bruce A. So Bruce A had the ability to divert a variable amount of steam to A, heat the campus, B, run the Bruce Energy Center, which was greenhouses and all sorts of other processes, as well as run these heavy water plants. But initially the heavy water was produced, run by fossil fuels. It was coal, wasn't it, Tom?
Oil. Oil fired.
Okay.
To be specific, ordinary water that you get in a lake or a river or the ocean contains about 1 part in 6,000 of deuterium. So that's why heavy water is so expensive, because there is so little of it in the natural water, in ordinary water, and to extract it is a very difficult process, a very energy intensive process. However, the neat thing about it is that unlike fuel, you can keep using it and reusing it in subsequent reactors. It never goes away,
That's pretty good. So, except it can evaporate like anything else, I suppose.
Yes, you can have leaks. That's one of the complications of CANDU reactors is the heavy water management. You have to always keep worrying about where your heavy water is leaking. You have to try to capture it and to try to bring it back into the system. Typically, what we do in CANDU stations is we have industrial size dehumidifiers, which capture any heavy water that gets into the air inside the reactor building, condense it, send it back into an upgrading system, and then it goes back into the reactor.
Oh, so it's considered pretty valuable.
If I remember, the cost of the total inventory of a single CANDU 6 reactors is on the order of 200 million. Have I got that right? And the other reason for recovering the heavy water is because it is contaminated with tritium. So you want those industrial dehumidifiers inside the reactor building to capture as much of it as possible, because the heavy water is also carrying tritium.
Interesting. So there's positive and there's negative in terms of the advantages of using the fuel that is unenriched, right?
Right.
So unenriched fuel is cheap, but it's costly in the sense that it needs the deuterium.
Yeah, needs the heavy water.
Fascinating. So then the moderator is like natural water, just regular water is only for cooling. It's not for a moderator, right?
No, the standard CANDU reactors use heavy water for both cooling as well as moderation. The moderator heavy water is maintained at a relatively low temperature, about 80 degrees Celsius, inside the calandria, whereas the cooling heavy water goes through the pressure tubes where the fuel is. Okay, so you have two different heavy water systems.
I'm glad you mentioned pressure tubes, because that's the next topic. How do pressure tubes give an advantage over, say, one large pressurized container?
Well, it's not really an advantage as much as it was a design choice difference. It was advantageous for Canada because we didn't have any heavy forging capacity. So rather than outsourcing that somewhere else, the pressure tube design allowed us to make everything in-house. And so we didn't, and so that's part of the reason that the CANDU supply chain is more than 95% in Canada. So there's a great deal of security associated with that. The pressure tube design is essentially modular. You replace these pressure tubes, but as we've seen with PWRs and BWRs, the pressure vessel, which is what they use, originally it was expected those were only going to last 40 years, and then they discovered, well, maybe 60 years now, and now we're looking at 80 years. And those don't require an extensive core replacement, which is what we do with the CANDUs at 30 to 40 years. And there's a cost to that. So our refurbishment projects are essentially where, that's the key component, but they do a whole pile of other maintenance activities at the same time, because it makes sense at that midlife point to change out things like steam generators, upgrade control systems, and maybe swap out a turbine if it looks like that needs to be done. So you kind of roll all of this other work, which also happens at PWR and BWRs, but it happens at different intervals. We kind of just turn it into one giant project.
So is it also responsible for this notion of being able to refuel while it's running?
Well, that's why Darlington has 1,106, or if you ask Tom, 1,105 days of uninterrupted generation, which only...
It's the data that says that.
I know, but OPG says it's 1,106.
Yeah, it's the data.
So, I mean, you can't do that with other designs. So being able to refuel online has allowed us to hold... the CANDUs have held the majority of the record runtimes. Darlington holds not only the longest nuclear plant runtime, but the longest thermal plant runtime in history, which is pretty impressive.
So it's something to be proud of, wouldn't you say, that ability?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And originally it was supposed to lead to much higher capacity factors, and it did, right? Because American reactors had to be taken offline for months at a time to be refueled, whereas the CANDU was just refueling online. But they got those maintenance intervals, the refueling intervals, down significantly, which brought their capacity factor up, because their refueling, it's almost once every 2 years, but it's not quite. It's usually 18 to 24 months, somewhere in that range. Now, if you look at France, the capacity factors of the French fleet are nowhere near the U.S. capacity factors, and they're nowhere near our capacity factors, because they still have very long refueling and maintenance outages. They haven't got that process, shrunk down and optimized like the Americans have, but they have so many units. It's like they've just never needed to. There's never been that pressure to optimize that process with EDF.
Yeah. And what about the whole concept of refurbishing? It's a big deal in Canada. I don't hear about other countries talking about it very much. What is it about CANDUs that's different?
Well, they do refurbish American reactors. PWRs and BWRs do get refurbished, but it's not the same process. They'll typically, if they've got a project where, let's say, they're upgrading a generator, or maybe they're replacing the steam generators and upgrading some control systems, they'll call that a refurbishment.
Okay, sure.
With CANDUs, it's a very formal process that happens because you're replacing pressure tubes, and that has to be done. So we tend to, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of roll those other tasks in with it. Financially, it makes more sense to do all of that at once. It's a couple $2 billion per unit, roughly, which seems expensive. But to do, let's say, Pickering, it's going to be maybe $10 billion.
Yeah. Okay.
It's less than half the price of building a new plant, and you'll get another 50 years out of it. So
true. It's pretty amazing.
At that point, it's a bargain.
Yeah.
And it's
absolutely. A lot of people don't understand the numbers and the duration and all that. So that's it helps put it in perspective. Is it worth it? Are you getting your money back? And certainly are, right?
Oh, yeah. And one of the things, as we're seeing with Bruce, is that when they get refurbished, the operation performance improves significantly. Bruce is the best. Bruce A units 1 and 2 have the highest capacity factor in our fleet at 93%. I think for that one's for Bruce 1, and Bruce 2 is like 92.5. So these are world-class uptimes. And now Bruce is operating all of the units. So they are adding the equivalent of another entire reactor to the site just through improving the output of these units. So they're going to be north of 7 gigawatts, which is incredible. Yeah. And that's going to offset the loss of Pickering A units 1 and 4 when they retire next year.
I see. Bruce has been sort of neck and neck with other nuclear plants in terms of the biggest in the world.
Yeah, there's the plant in Japan that's shut down that has a higher nameplate capacity. Yeah. And then there's a plant in South Korea that has a higher nameplate capacity because they just brought another unit online. Mm-hmm. Though they are going to be retiring one of the older units. I think that's Corey. They are going to be retiring one of the older units, so that will bring that capacity down. And of course, we've looked at building Bruce C. There was supposed to be a C site, an additional 4 units. So if we were to add that, it would be largest thermal plant in the world. Considering
that the Americans have around 97 plants now, nuclear plants, and we have, we have 4 basically, right? And
but a lot of the American plants are like single unit.
Oh, right, yeah.
Whereas ours are all of the ones in Ontario are multi-unit.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm getting at is there's some explanation on why Canada has made, like we even had the biggest coal plant in North America for a long time.
Well, this is Tom's ballpark here. This is all Ontario Hydro.
Yeah, is it? Yeah. So can you explain why Canada would have the biggest coal plant or some of the biggest nuclear plants? Is there some logic to the maybe the economy of the government or the government involvement?
No, it's basically the result of a vertically integrated utility. You had much the same process happening like Tennessee Valley Authority, maybe to a slightly lesser extent. But Ontario Hydro started building plants, and they would build them in unit pairs. So even when you get to the Hearn plant, for instance, I won't bother with the Windsor plant, the Keith plant. It was fairly small. But Hearn, it was built 2 units at a time. And the first 4 units were only 100 megawatts. The second 4 were 200 megawatts. So that plant ended up with 8 units in there. When they started building Lakeview, again, unit pairs. They started off with the building 2 units, then they added 2 more, and then they added 4 more, and that became an 8-unit plant. And Nanticoke ended up going the same way. It was being built about the same time the Lambton coal plant in Sarnia, or just south of Sarnia. The Lambton plant stopped at 4 units. They didn't go to 8 units there, but the Nanticoke plant did. And it was actually larger than the 4,000 megawatts. Originally, when it was designed to use basically coal from West Virginia, high sulfur coal. Those units were 550 megawatt units. And then when the environmental restrictions started getting into there, they had to go to low sulfur blends, and that actually restricted the capability of the units just slightly under 500 megawatts apiece.
Okay.
And just getting a little bit sidetracked, but it was a weird factor there. The electrostatic precipitators, which take the ash out of the exhaust or effluent, whatever you want to call it, the smoke, they're much more effective when they have high sulfur content. They actually attracted the particulates much easier. So, it actually increased the particulate pollution out of the units, and so they had to throttle them back. So, but that's how it ended up being a plant like that. That's how Pickering ended up at 8 units as well.
So economies of scale has something to do with it. And what about
that and transmission? Ontario Hydro was big at building at transmission corridors. So you don't just have one transmission tower line running from one location in the province to another. You have a number of them, 2, 3, 4.
Now, do we have a bidding process for our grid? Like, I know the Americans do.
You'll hear a lot of people saying that we don't have a running market, but the whole market dispatch runs on a machine, on a computer, and it decides mathematically on the offers that are put into the system on what to dispatch. And that's how it gets dispatched.
Okay, and we don't do this, like, they talk about, after reading Meredith Angwin's book, you've probably heard about her book. She talks about the bidding process and how it can, how they treat basically wind and solar and gas as equals, and which is kind of not true of their performance capabilities, right? So do we do that in Canada?
Well, what do you mean by gas is equal?
Well, equal in the sense that
it's really not as equal.
It's not dispatchable, right? Gas is dispatchable. Wind and solar are not.
Gas is dispatchable. Yeah. They're treated much the same way here in Ontario. They get a certain amount of money, per megawatt hour that they produce. Even when they're curtailed, they get paid. I think it's a slightly smaller rate, but not by much. And when they first came on the grid, they were actually forcing the nuclear units to back off. But that has a cost. You're starting to dump steam into condensers. You're starting to put more heat into the lake. In the meantime, all these wind turbines are spinning, just pushing you into nuclear costs because it's eroding the steam condensers that are at the plants. The fish are getting, there are the temperature restrictions, so they're not getting warmer water, but they're getting lots more warm water, put it that way, because it's flowing through the plant faster.
Okay, wow.
So Ontario decided, operationally and environmentally, it made more sense to allow the nuclear units to stay loaded and curtail the wind. So you just shut the wind turbine off. So they're not spinning, they're not chopping up the odd bird here or there or bat. And on top of that, it's extending the life of those facilities because they're not running, right? They're not wearing out. So it's a win all the way around. And they're so easy to dispatch. You just switch them on and off, the individual wind turbines. So you can, easily dispatch them as long as you have the fuel available there. So within the available wind, they're quite easily dispatchable.
So how does, before wind and solar came along, we had nuclear reactors, and we had quite a manageable grid, at least as far as I understand. But something happened that made that management change because of unpredictable elements, right? Wind and solar introduced where we had to start bypassing the steam in the reactors. Is that something that was always done, or is that something more of a modern phenomenon?
There were periods where you had excess power, where you had to throttle back the nuclear plants. But back in the 90s, when we had the 8 Bruce units on, 8 Pickerings, and the 4 Darlingtons came on, and you had the big recession in 92, overnight was a big problem, and every night you'd be backing off the nuclear units.
Yeah, because you don't.
And they would.
Yeah,
and they would do that on reactor power. At that time, it was still vertically integrated, so you could do command and control, which means you could dovetail the hydroelectric generators into what you were doing with the nuclear units, and actually run them hard during the day to get as much water out as you can, and then store as much as you could overnight, which you can't do under a market system.
Anyway.
Back in the 90s, they did it in reactor power, and they'd have two modes of reduction on them, what they called a shallow maneuver and a deep maneuver. And a deep maneuver you could only do once or twice a week. The shallow maneuver you could almost do every night. And every evening, the operators would tell you how much they can do based on what the reactor physics were doing at the time. So shallow maneuver was anywhere from 20 to 40 megawatts per unit. The deep maneuvers were up to 150, 200 megawatts down. Basically, the biggest maneuvers were right down to the 65% reactor power, which is sort of the maintenance level for the reactor. After that, the reaction starts dying off if they get below that. So we were doing that. The difference now is the units don't maneuver on reactor power anymore. So that's why you get into dumping into the steam condensers. And those were originally put in the units. Again, if you lose the generator for some reason, you can have the loss of the generator. It trips off due to an electrical disturbance or a problem with the generator that's easily fixed. And the CANDUs were designed to set the reactor back to 65% reactor power and use these condensers to keep the reactor running. So when you did your quick fix in the generator, they could come right back on rather than having to wait 2 days to start up the reactor again. Mm-hmm. And that's where these condensers came from. And now we're using them for excess to actually dump steam into them with the unit, with the generator on to reduce the megawatts in the generators. So that's what they're doing with those now. They weren't actually installed to do this reduction. They were installed to maintain the reactor while the generator was off.
Yeah, Bruce calls it flexible output now. It's got a branding term to it. But per Tom's point, if I was reading one of the history documents on basically the turning up of the Bruce site and what was going on there, and transmission disruptions were quite common in the early days of the Bruce site. And so one of the design parameters for that location was to simply have these units have these flexible characteristics. So bypass into the condenser to immediately drop electrical output. And then I believe what Tom was describing, I think you referred to them as step backs or setbacks to me, right? At one point.
Yeah, it's a step back.
Deep in the shallow maneuvers.
Yeah.
Well,
no, those terms are for automatic operations.
Oh, okay.
They just called it a maneuver, reactor maneuver.
But actually, the technical requirements of a new maneuver involves the control rods.
No, they're just straight steam. The current maneuvers are just straight steam. Yeah.
Oh, even
they can dump up to 2,400 megawatts at the Bruce site.
Okay.
So 2.4 gigawatts is the capacity. They can technically do it on all 8 units. Mm-hmm. So they offer it up as up to 2,400 megawatts of flexible capacity. I don't think we've ever done all 8 units. That's a ton of heat being rejected into the lake. But that's how it's sold. And we, as Tom noted, we used to do that to allow wind on the grid. So, it's 3 a.m, the demand's really low, the wind shows up, and we're dumping steam at Bruce. So we stopped doing that process. So now we spill hydro instead.
What you will find, though, when you get down into curtailing the wind generation, the market can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
So as far as I know, I don't know this directly, but I think the operators at the IESO will direct specific wind farms to reduce various amounts of megawatts. And while they're down in that mode, the wind, as I mentioned before, is actually on dispatch. That's what they're dispatching up and down to follow the load. So you will have a little bit of wind still loaded when the nuclear units start reducing on their curtailment, because the IESO operators are still using the wind to do the minute-to-minute dispatch.
So minute-to-minute dispatch with wind is sort of a contradictory statement. Like, how do you dispatch wind?
Because you've dispatched it down, you have more wind available than what you're using. So the fuel is there. You can start them up. You can shut them down. They're on dispatch. I don't call it curtailment at all. I call it they're on dispatch. When you think about it, say Costa Rica, which is basically all hydroelectric. Do you think they use every ounce of water that they have? No. Their system, the generators go up and down, and when they can't use the water, they're dumping it past the dam.
I see.
And it's on dispatch. It's not curtailed. It's on dispatch. That's what the demand. They can only supply as much as demand that's there, right?
Yeah.
Anything extra really is not needed. So it's not really curtailed because there's no use for it. You just bypass.
So I guess you could say that it's only dispatchable to a point, and then if there's no wind, you're in trouble.
No, well, then you get into the hydroelectric.
So
and the hydroelectric the market can dispatch it because it has a price, because in Ontario, water costs money. There's a water rental fee on water. There isn't on air, there isn't on photons, but there's a water rental fee on water, which means the first hydroelectric units that come up cost like $2 or $3 a megawatt hour, and then it goes up to about the $7-8 range for some, and then you get up into the $15 range, and at the top end, the big plants cost $30 a megawatt. It's actually more expensive than gas at times because natural gas is so cheap.
Wow.
So don't think of water is free in Ontario. It's not. It costs money.
Okay.
Now, we pay for that when we spill it, though, too, don't we?
I believe so. Now, there's a certain amount of water that has to run. The baseload water, it comes in at $0. There is a water rental fee charged for it, but they can't dispatch it. So you'll see roughly 3,000 megawatts of water running when you're into these modes. And that's what confuses people when they're looking at the Ontario market. They scratch their heads and they say, what the heck's going on here? Because the price is zero, the water's running, the wind's down. Now we're getting nuclear units down. And it gets even more complicated when they have to get gas plants started up. They come into that zero cost regime too, coming up to minimum load. And you're still in that mode of dispatching with the wind generation at $0.
Now, of course, the wind turbines do have an impact on the market rate. Like today, it was windy and we had low demand, and it was half a cent a kilowatt hour on the market. Yep. And of course, they're not being paid half a cent, because even though, as you mentioned, that the market's dispatch and the prices we're seeing on the market, because everything's on fixed rate contracts, they're getting the 15 cents per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, but the dispatch price is close to zero, and that's what the dispatch tool dispatches to. Yeah. It doesn't care about these background costs.
No.
And that's what people have to get in their heads. The market in Ontario is dispatched by a machine. The operators, they only intervene for security and emergencies. Other than that, it's a computer doing the dispatching.
Yeah. And Ontario Hydro was significantly more efficient than this process, correct, with the vertical integration?
Oh, yeah, because you dovetailed everything together. In a market, everything that goes in there is 1 hour blocks.
I want to know about this computer doing the work. Like the computer has to alert an operator, right? It doesn't simply turn on a machine for you, does it?
It sends out the dispatches. The operators monitor it, and they'll intervene when they have to.
So they respond.
But every 5 minutes, It calculates and sends out the next target to all the generators.
But it's still operator control. So they have to respond to what the computer
supervised.
Supervised. Okay.
Supervised. At the other end, most of the plants now are automated. They get a number where they're supposed to go to, and their computers take the unit to wherever it's supposed to go to.
Okay. And
we're living in a very technical age.
And the supervision,
we need a lot of IT people.
The supervision must include little warning signals, parameters when it reaches past a certain point. You get an alert, those kind of things.
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The guy can, the operator, like at the ISO, can intervene. He can block the whole dispatch. He can block individual dispatches to units. He can send out manual dispatches, which is what I think they end up doing when they're into the wind generators. They're sending out manual dispatches.
Interesting.
I think. I'm not positive on that, but there's no price driver for the tool to dispatch to, because it's sitting at a flat $0 a megawatt hour. So it.
That's great.
Doesn't know what to do.
I appreciate your expertise. I want to get back to the concept of what's under the hood, and I wanted to read something because I think it comes from a textbook that actually Jaro gave me the name of. I believe it was Jaro. It was called The Essential CANDU. And it just speaks to something that I think needs to be addressed I'll just read it right now. It says, heat is generated in the nuclear reactor and electricity is produced by the electrical generator. The production and discharge of this energy must be perfectly balanced. The steam generator is the key component for maintaining this balance. That is, the rate of steam generation must match the rate of steam flow to the steam turbine or vice versa. Any change in these two energy flows will immediately be reflected as a change in steam pressure in the steam generator. Therefore, steam pressure is a key control parameter for the entire plant under all operating conditions. So that's kind of interesting. So I asked the question, is this dependent on maintenance, or how much of is it a balancing act by a machine or by operator? Is the operator making these adjustments when necessary?
Well, when it's just sitting there running along, it's a machine doing it on its own computers.
Okay.
It does it all on its own. The operators will give the reactor manual instructions.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you want it to go up, go down, they can dial change the reactor power manually. But normally the CANDU units now run on the turbine following the reactor, what they call reactor leading, which means the reactor does its thing and the turbine control systems follow whatever the reactor is delivering to keep that balance in place.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, that's pretty neat.
It's minor fluctuations. When you look at the outputs of the CANDU units, they're only moving around 1 or 2 megawatts. Now you'll see drifting going on and outputs from hour to hour if the reactor is changing a little bit, and that's due to the physics of the reactors. Sometimes they have a little bit of an issue where they have to manually adjust the reactor down, or they can adjust it back up. But when you look at a generator on the system that's running automatically, with the reactor running at full, ignoring limitations that they might have on the reactor, it's running at its full capability. The output of those generators is pretty steady. Like, I mean, the variability of the output of the turbine trying to balance the steam process is very small. Only a megawatt or two moving around.
An operator needs to be alert, I suppose, right? Like, can't fall asleep on the job.
No, can't do that. They have a lot of things to monitor. You're watching these things, just like the pilot in the cockpit of an airplane. Yeah. I mean, the airplanes fly themselves for the most part. They can even take off and land on their own if they let them, but the pilots don't like to do that. Like, they like to manually take off and land, but as soon as they get in the air, even while the landing gear is coming up, they're already switching on the autopilot and the machine's doing the whole driving until they get to the final parts of the landing process. And it's the same for these nuclear units, same thing.
There's a degree.
Fly by wire.
I guess.
And of course, the pilots are watching all the time.
Yeah.
Make sure everything's running right. And it's the same with the operators in a nuclear plant and the grid operators as well. And the market operators running the markets are watching the thing, doing the thing, and they're ready to intervene.
Now the self-driving car, too. Bill Gates did a little thing where he gets into a cab and it's self-driving, and they have a woman sitting at the wheel, but she's not moving the wheel. She's there just in case she's needed. So, yeah. So it's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering. I've never been involved in CANDU plant operations, so this is a curious point for me to ask about. Maybe somebody can answer. I would expect some of those minor variations in the reactor power output to be due to ongoing fueling operations, because these go on all the time. So, might make a difference, maybe a few hundred kilowatts here and there as the fuel bundles are changed out, right? Am I correct in that?
That's right. You can watch that process in really vivid action at Pickering 8. They seem to have quite a few issues where the fueling stops and the output of the unit starts fading. And they'll drift down over a couple of days from their full output down to 450, 400 megawatts till they get the fueling process starting again. But what you got to keep in mind, though, this balance in the unit itself, the steam energy balance, the generators can go from full to zero on the steam valves in a matter of seconds, probably in a second, right? So it's really not any effort at all for the generator to respond to an increase or decrease in the steam that's being sent to it. You know, the CANDU units have another mode called reactor following the turbine. And Bruce actually used to use that when the transmission was limited and they were up against the transmission limits. Because you'd have like 5,000, 5,500 megawatt limit of the flow out of the complex, and you're running within 20, 30 megawatts of this limit. And you can't have the generators moving up and down with what the reactors want to do. You have to actually have the reactors fine-tune themselves to what you wanted the turbine to do to sit close to these limits. So, but now, as far as I know, all the CANDU units run with the reactor leading, the turbine following.
Yeah, Tom might have been an interesting point there. So the transmission capacity to Bruce was initially undersized. The plant was originally, 6,400 and I think it was 6,440 because the B units were all 860. But the plant was derated, but as Tom said, there wasn't the transmission capacity, so that wasn't fixed until 2011 with the Milton line.
Yeah.
Which is when they added, and it was funny because the Ontario Clean Air Alliance was like, oh, there's no point in building the Milton line because the Bruce units are going to be shut down in 2016. And of course, that never never happened. It was ridiculous. But yes, I think there's about, either 7,500 or 8 gigawatts of capacity, of transmission capacity there now, which is great now that they're looking to actually increase the output of the site even further.
And what accounts for that difference?
They've added more lines. Or are you talking about the uprates?
Yeah, I guess, the uprate, yeah.
Well, first off, they're pulling the D rate, or they're planning on pulling the D rate. They haven't pulled the D rate yet. In the 90s, there were some concerns about if there was a large fuel channel break at Bruce, a large loss of cooling incident, how quickly the unit could be shut down because it only has a single coolant loop. So you could potentially lose up to half the coolant in the unit. Darlington has 2 loops, so you could only ever lose up to 25% of the coolant. So it's not as much of an issue, or it wasn't seen to be an issue at Darlington or at Pickering. So this is a Bruce-specific issue. The other issue is, of course, that Bruce has the highest thermal capacity of any of our units. So they have the potential to make the most power. So that kind of compounded the problem. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission originally limited them to 60% reactor power. Then they bumped that up to 70%. And then there were some revisions made and improvements. They changed the direction of fueling. They dropped the number of bundles down, if I remember correctly. They were originally 13 and they dropped down to 12, which is the same as Darlington. And there were some other mitigation schemes put into place that eventually allowed the power to creep up to where it is right now, which is, I think, 93.5% for the A units and 94% for the B units.
Yeah.
So the B units make about 825 approximately, and we're now seeing 825, 826, 828 out of units 1 and 2 at Bruce A. They're running a higher D rate and they're producing more power. So the limit will be the generator. But if you take that number and you kind of turn it into a ratio, you can get a rough idea of what the unit should make with the D rates pulled, and it should be around 890 megawatts. So, assuming the A units don't quite have the headroom that the B units have, let's say, they run out a generator at 880 or something like that. and the B units have more headroom because they were originally 860. You're looking at almost 7,100 megawatts.
This gets to my next question, because there's a kind of a gray area when you're discussing what makes a plant live longer. Like I say, how do the new designs for the CANDU?
Oh, I have a slide for that.
How do they make them last longer than 30 years? So we're talking about some of the same things, aren't we? The upgrades?
No? Yes and no, I guess. For the CANDUs, once you replace the pressure tubes, you essentially double the life. But it's not really that simple, because the new pressure tubes are better than the old pressure tubes. And I have a screen share for that.
Oh, yes, very good.
Second here.
Yeah.
So this is a pressure tube evolution. So you can see Pickering, Bruce, Darlington, early C6s, cold work ZR 2.5 MB, right?
Yeah.
And then you can see the current CANDU 6 with low H and CL. And then you have the new one, the ACR cold work. So this is sort of the evolutionary process of the pressure tubes. So they've gotten better. And if I switch to this one,
what period of time do those represent?
I don't know. The current one is, I think we're on like generation 6 or something like that.
Oh, okay.
So like the current pressure tubes were like the ones in Darlington, right? So you're talking late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, okay.
Those were expected to last roughly 30 years.
Okay, yeah. So this represents the whole history of the CANDU, pretty much.
Yep. Yeah, basically, or that in that design.
Okay.
Okay. So you can see hydrogen uptake. And you can see how with the original Zirc alloy 2, it was very quick. And then you can see how much slower it is with the current CANDU 6, the ZR 2.5 NB. So this has been improved even more.
What are those bottom units there?
Oh, that's my
years.
Wanting to change. Yeah, time and years.
Oh, okay.
So in speaking to one of the operators at Darlington, it was posited that we may get 35 to 40 years out of the new alloy. So again, this brings back the whole better than new with the refurb, because with a new unit you have teething pains, right? Like we've seen with OL3 in Finland, like we're going to see at Vogel. You don't have that with a unit that's mature, because it's quirks. There's one of the Darlington units, or is it one of the Pickering units, Tom's, that vibrates? It's one of the Pickering units, Pickering 5, isn't it?
Number 5, yeah.
Yeah. So they have these quirks, and you have this intimate familiarity with the unit and how it works, and what works best. So you keep all of that with the refurbishment. The unit is already optimized. Your operation of it is already optimized, but you're replacing key components with better components.
So it's just a very good alloy of some kind.
Well, that's just the pressure tubes. Yeah, it's a better alloy with these new pressure tubes. But I'm talking about the unit as a whole. Mm. Like we saw with Bruce units 1 and 2, the upgraded control systems and the changes they made there dramatically increased the capacity factor of those units. They just don't have the downtime that the other units have. So you get those improvements as part of this process. So not only are you getting better pressure tubes, you're getting higher unit output and better reliability. And so that brings us to another interesting little quirk, and that's this lovely sheet. If we're going to specifically talk about Pickering for a minute, we might as well. So with Darlington, the 30 years ended up being about right. As you can see with Darlington Unit 1, right, you got 212,000 full power hours, 114 ppm of HEQ, right? The limit's 120. and they're figuring it was going to hit that around 229,000 full power hours.
Probably expand on what HEQ is.
Yeah.
Oh, hydrogen equivalent concentrations, the amount of hydrogen uptake is, but it causes embrittlement. It's basically pressure tubes are very ductile, and as they pick up hydrogen, they become more and more brittle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
you remember the chart we were just looking at, and it had that really quick increase in that earlier alloy. Sure. That was actually the tube alloy that was associated with the brake and the Pickering 2 unit back in the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
When they had the loss of coolant leak.
Interesting.
And that was due to hydrogen uptake. It causes brittle spots in the tubes, and then you get cracking. And that one, well, there was a couple of factors too. There was
the annulus spacers.
The pressure tubes sit in the fuel channel, which is a sort of an external tube around it. That's the shield, and there's spacers in there to keep the two separate. And the spacers had actually moved, and the pressure tube was touching the calandria tube, so it was causing even more issues there. But that's the one that caused the problem. So you can see how much safer the existing pressure tubes are, but they run to a hydrogen equivalent. The limit is 120
parts per million.
We're talking about the heated heavy water produces hydrogen, especially because of
the heated heavy water, and couple that with fission.
Yeah, I think it's actually tritium, but they call it a hydrogen equivalent.
Yeah. And so it gets deposited, the hydrogen gets picked up and deposited, becomes part of the alloy, and it makes it brittle, or it increases the level of brittleness. And so the model that's pursued with the CANDU is leak before break. Right? You don't want the tube to split like what happened with Pickering Unit 2. Sure. You want the tube to leak first. And so this fracture toughness model is based on the tube leaking before it breaks. And once you hit a certain level of brittleness, the risk is that it's going to split rather than leak. So that's what establishes these limits. And these are very conservative limits, but these are what have been established. So you look at the 120 parts per million limit, but then you go on down and you look at Pickering. And then you see that, well, Pickering Unit 6 is going to had 250,000 full power hours, but it only had a hydrogen concentration of 77.6. So it had massively more hours than Darlington Unit 1, but significantly less hydrogen uptake. And this is due to the lower levels of neutron flux in the core and the fact that Pickering uses different fuel bundles. Pickering uses a 28 element bundle versus the 37 element bundle that are used in the other units. So we're talking about unit age here, and you'd expect that all of the units that use the same alloy would age at the same rate, but that's not true when it comes to Pickering because of these differences. So Pickering's more like a 45, 50 years between refurb units rather than the 30 years that we'd see with Bruce and Darlington. So Pickering's somewhat unique.
Yeah, Pickering is a tortoise. It'll run longer, at a lower output. And the other units are the hares, right? They run so much higher output, but a shorter life.
Yeah. So, and that comes back to economics, right? Is that, Pickering, you're not getting as much power per reactor unit as you are with Bruce and Darlington. But the flip side of that is you can run it, 10, 15 years longer between refurbishments, which more than makes up for that.
Right.
That's the logic associated with refurbishing Pickering B, is that it'll outlive the other two plants.
Wow. Nice.
Simply because it can run so much longer on the same alloys.
So when you talk about new designs of CANDUs, where does that fit into the discussion?
Well, the new design would be is the EC6, for example, which, as you saw on the previous slide, CANDU 6, okay. Right? And so the EC6 is an evolution of the CANDU 6. It's the current. I'm going to close this now. It's the current export model. It's what's built at Qinshan in China.
Right. Okay.
And it's just a more efficient, revised version of the CANDU 6, which is Gentilly 2, Point Le Pro. Those are both CANDU 6s. So they took that design and they made it even more modular. They optimized it and improved things. It became the enhanced CANDU 6, the EC6. And it's designed to have a 90% capacity factor. So actually slightly lower than what we're seeing with Bruce at 1 and 2. But, it's supposed to be a very economic to build and very economic to operate modern reactor design. It's Gen 3 Plus, has a ton of passive safety features, but then they all do. All the CANDUs have a ton of passive safety features, but they're advertised features with the EC6. And then there's the the EC6 derivative or EC6 alternative flavor, the AFCR, which is the Advanced Fuel CANDU reactor, which is basically the same reactor, but vetted to run on like MOX fuel and thorium and other things, even though they all can. Like there's fundamentally no real difference. You could run a thorium fuel cycle in Pickering if you wanted to. It's licensed by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. You could build them at Darlington B tomorrow. It's already licensed in Canada.
Okay, and
for construction.
They automatically seem to add quite a bit of lifetime to the reactor.
No, it's the same lifetime as Darlington.
Is it?
Like it's 30 years between refurbs, so roughly a 60-year lifespan.
And how would you describe the advantages of it?
It's supposed to be cheaper to operate, lower staffing. They've made improvements in certain areas, so less maintenance downtime. But all of these improvements are being made to Darlington and Bruce right now during the refurbishment.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. So essentially, refurbing is kind of transforming them as well.
Yeah, you're adding improvements. Yeah. Comically enough, the 1105 day run at Darlington wasn't stopped by an unplanned event.
Right. So you could have a car and replace the engine. That's an exaggeration, but if you had to make some kind of analogy, you're putting in an improved engine.
But just to that point, so Darlington Unit 1 ran 1,105 days. Yeah. 1,105 days in a few hours. What stopped that run was a necessary hours-based maintenance outage. They had to take the unit offline to perform a test or inspect something because it hit a certain number of hours between when that test was last performed. So they hit a necessary milestone that required that unit to go off.
Right.
That test can now be done with the unit online.
Okay. Cool.
So there is potential for a run significantly longer than 1,105 days in the future. And I know that there a couple of the operators are seeing that as a challenge now.
What I want to get into next is what is it about burner reactors that is attractive, and can the CANDU be a burner reactor?
You're talking about fast spectrum reactors?
Well, not necessarily. Being able to use waste as fuel, basically.
Okay. Yeah, most of those are breeders, fast spectrum reactors, which allow greater utilization of products that can't be consumed in a light water reactor. Mm-hmm. Of course, CANDU is not a light water reactor. It's a heavy water reactor. So it has superior neutron economy, and it can consume fissile things that a light water reactor can't. But you still have a waste product.
Right.
Like you can use one of my favorite quotes. There was a study done, I think it was McMaster, where they investigated the feasibility of doing reprocessing of CANDU fuel. And of course, Purex, which is the reprocessing technology utilized in France, where they break down the fuel and extract the plutonium and other things to make fresh fuel. Well, the tailings from the enrichment process, so what's left over from the enrichment process, has more fissile material than CANDU waste. So you don't have much to work with. So the economics of reprocessing CANDU fuel, natural uranium fuel, where it was essentially zero. But they did pursue or investigate rather using a novel reprocessing method using fluorine, which technically yielded a viable product at the end, but it was very expensive. And it did have much higher burnup. I think it was 4 times longer, which is considerable. But the cost of fabrication and extraction were essentially insurmountable obstacles, which is why we've never taken it beyond proof of concept. So, I mean, technically, yes, you could reprocess CANDU fuel. Would you? No. Canada has so much uranium and the grade is so high.
But there's some conditions. Wouldn't you say that if we did have, say, an IMSR, the terrestrial energy reactor?
That's, again, spent CANDU fuel is different.
Yeah.
The only reactor that's specifically focused on recycling CANDU fuel is the Maltex design. The rest of them are all looking at LWR and BWR fuel, so slightly enriched fuel, right?
I see, okay.
Which has significantly more fissile content.
I have a more practical outlook on this.
Barrett,
I still don't. No. I still don't understand what the benefit is of running that stuff through the Maltex, because right now the spent fuel bundles out of a CANDU reactor are self-contained.
Yep.
They're a nice little metal module that you can easily put in a canister and put away. They're based on natural uranium. So the dangerous radioactivity on those decays in about 400 to 500 years. And they're no more dangerous than mine tailings. There's not a lot of it. There's one hockey rink's worth, a telephone pole deep or high. I mean, you're not talking about a lot of stuff.
No. Well, Jaro has the DGR.
Makes sense.
I mean, you should be talking about the DGR right now, Jaro.
That's Sheila's baby.
Before we do that, maybe I could comment. I would agree with Tom on the point that he made about Maltex. If you don't mind talking about that just a bit longer. And actually, the situation is less attractive than Tom said. The amount of plutonium in spent CANDU fuel, I believe, is 0.6%, and that is the fraction that Maltex want to extract to use in their reactor, molten chloride reactor. The rest goes into conversion into some sort of a stable form that will have to go into a DGR. There you go, there's the DGR.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting. So there's a molten salt chloride reactor? No, it's not molten.
Correct, yes.
It is? Okay.
Yeah. Yes, it is. The Maltex, yes, it is.
Okay.
They have a separate salt for the fuel, which is a plutonium chloride, and they have a different salt for the coolant, which is outside the fuel tubes, which I believe is a sodium fluoride. Sodium chloride or something like a sodium fluoride. Anyway, it's different from the fuel.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah, per Tom's point, I mean, you've got these CANDU fuel bundles, which are all self-contained. They're not dangerous for very long, because as I noted, the CANDU waste has less fissile material on it than the tailings from the enrichment process, right? So you're dealing with something that has, that's not super dangerous after a reasonably short period of time, and then that danger drops off a cliff over a few hundred years, and it becomes very benign. It's no more dangerous than the ore that was mined in the first place. And it's very different from this, this molten salt waste that we don't have a storage plan for.
Go ahead, Jaro.
If I could comment on that. the pitch that Moltex are making, or at least should be making, because that's what their idea is, by extracting the plutonium, which has a half-life of, 24,000 years, and fissioning it, you're basically destroying the worst part of the spent fuel from CANDU fuel bundles. So, that's a valid point. And the other valid point, I guess, that I would agree with is that they're starting on the road to building, fast reactors, advanced reactors. And I certainly wouldn't fault them for doing that. I'm more in favor of that than, for instance, trying to build fusion power plants, So that's my point of view anyway.
Exactly, sure. Good point.
And I have a question for you on that, Jaro. So the waste product that we get out of the Moltex, the waste burner, the one that consumes the CANDU waste, is that at all workable with a fast reactor? Like, could you further utilize that in a fast reactor and end up with something, even less dangerous?
Oh, absolutely. The initial Moltex, what do they call it? SSRW, Stable Salt Reactor Waste Utilization.
That's right, SSRW, Stable Salt Waste Burner.
It's strictly intended to run on pure plutonium chloride fuel. But they do say that, if in the future anybody wanted, they could certainly include some of the uranium in the spent CANDU fuel with the plutonium and run it on that. It's just, for some reason they figure they're not going to do that at the beginning. And like you say, yes, certainly all the rest of the uranium in spent CANDU fuel could be used in the fast reactor. But as you also said, natural uranium is a lot cheaper, and that is also then there is also huge amounts of depleted uranium from enrichment plants. So the amount of uranium around is just mountains and mountains, and it's sort of beside the whole point.
What about the proliferation concerns? Is that the plutonium management like a goal because of proliferation concerns?
Well, there is a concern for the people who work on that issue, like Jeremy Whitlock, who works with the IAEA Safeguards Division in Vienna. And in fact, they are involved with developers like Moltex to ensure that, before they even build anything, that their design meets the requirements of the safeguards. I feel that there's really not a public issue. It's a technical issue to be managed by the people who are concerned with those issues.
There's a group, Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and you should join if you're not. But we've, for instance, we've managed to organize a tour of one of the reactors that Chris has taken up. But occasionally we have people piping in from other communities, like Mark Nelson. There's the people in New York that were supportive of their reactors in the shutdown of Indian Point. But I guess Mark Nelson made an interesting point on the Decouple podcast run by our president of the Canadians for Nuclear Energy, Chris Kiefer. So he brought up the idea that CANDU is, in effect, a large modular reactor. I hadn't heard that term used before, and I thought that it's kind of fascinating to think that we've always had a modular reactor in a large form, and that people were praising the modular reactor, but I don't even, like, if you asked our politicians if they understood that we have modular reactors in Canada. Is there any advantage to it? First of all, the fact if they're large and modular, they can't be put on a train the same way that a small modular reactor can, but the parts are replaceable. I thought maybe you could get into that discussion between the three of you.
Let me start with that. SMR is a buzzword. Everybody's SMR, right?
Yeah.
They're in love with the term SMR. Mm-hmm. This BWRX 300 that they're building at Darlington, you can't put that on a flatbed. That's your normal plant that you have to build up and build the building and put all the parts into it and that. And what Mark was pushing was, well, if you think these things are modular, we have big modular reactors. And he went one step further. He called the CANDU a modular core large modular reactor. Because the core is modular, right? Mm-hmm. Every pressure tube is a module.
Okay, sure.
Right? So,
and he also called it immortal.
Yeah. But the advantage of a module is any part that's separate from the whole can be replaced. And where a normal plant, if something's wrong with the pressure vessel, you have to replace the whole pressure vessel. In a CANDU plant and the 380 channel reactors, only got to replace 1 out of 380 channels.
That's a lot of.
In the bigger reactors, it's 1 out of 480 channels. And same, the components that go in there, I mean, they were already modular to begin with because everything's fit together and the pipes are sort of standardized, even though they modify things here and there. And the pumps are all the same. They're all modules. The pumps plug in. You got 4, 8, or 12 of the same component that all plug in together. They've always been modular. And, it's just sort of to fight back at the small modular reactor is something magical. Well, maybe the tiny ones are. You can put them on a flatbed. Maybe the medium ones are where you have 8 reactor cores in it and you can bring the 8 reactor cores in on a flatbed. Mm-hmm. But geez, we've been bringing steam generators in on flatbeds into the Bruce plant for replacement. They're modules too. So it was basically just to fight back at that.
Yeah.
And one of the SMR designs is the same size as an EC6.
Physical size.
Yeah. Listen,
wow.
About the modularity of CANDU reactors, that's interesting, especially in respect to refurbishment, because I remember before I retired, this was probably sometime around 2005, maybe 2006, I remember Bruce Power was looking at doing refurbishment a different way. Because this business of replacing individual pressure tubes is a hell of a job. And at that time, I remember seeing CAD simulations by Bruce Power. This was all going around AECL because we were all connected, internal networks and all that. So there were these CAD simulations that Bruce Power came up with of replacing the entire calandria, pressure tubes and all, in one shot, and storing it in a building next door, and bringing in a complete calandria with all pressure tubes installed and sticking it in there. I mean, the idea was to avoid this bloody long job of replacing all the pressure tubes one by one. So, modularity, okay, you can call it that, but you could also say that replacing the whole core would be modular.
That's fascinating, actually, because I remember Terrestrial Energy talked about what do they do after I forget how many years, 7 years, 12 years. They leave them in the ground, and then they build a new one right next to it, and they leave that to let the fission products can die off and moderate and become less harmful. Decay, I guess is the word I was looking for. So it's not that different, really.
Quite a few of these new SMR startups are doing exactly the same type of thing. Torcon as well, on their barge-based reactor, they plan to have 2 units on operating, and then next to it have two slots for when the reactors, the operators, when they run out of their operating lot, they stick them in there and put new ones in, and the old ones they cool off until significantly less radioactive to be able to transport them back to the factory.
On that Bruce Power thing, I know that they did end up with some sort of special machine that makes the process a lot quicker, because I've seen pictures of it, which is part of the reason Unit 6 was able to be done so quickly.
Yeah, you saw it's done, eh? They're in the startup process again, as far as getting it ready for startup. The refurbishment is done.
Yep. They're talking about refueling it right now, actually.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar with what they do in their Bruce Power, what they do in their retubing. I was more familiar with what was planned for Jansi 2, which never happened. We had, complete process design for how that would be done. There was going to be a machine that chewed up the pressure tubes into little 2-inch squares, and those would be all packed into buckets and stored in concrete silos for radioactive waste. So this was all planned out. I'm not sure what exactly Bruce Power is doing. I don't think they're chewing up the old pressure tubes. I think they're removing them whole.
I think everything's in a warehouse. They have all of the steam generators in a warehouse, and I think if you've got steam generators, which are absolutely massive, you're not too concerned about the pressure tubes.
And not that radioactive. I was just thinking, talking about those little reactor cores, the modular reactors, and you let them, some of the radioactivity decay before you throw them on a truck and take them back to the factory. Bruce can't even get the steam generators off site. They're going to ship them out and have them recycled, right? Because the reactivity is so low, and it's just the problem with radioactivity is everybody has this fear of this invisible menace, and it doesn't matter if it's the size of a flea. It's you think that it's a lion, right? That's going to pounce on you, and it's a stupid little flea, right?
Yeah.
And they just have this irrational fear of it.
Oh, then you got coal plants dumping radioactivity into the
steam generator.
What were you saying, Jaro? I didn't quite catch that.
The Bruce steam generators were originally planned to be shipped to Sweden, to a specialist company named Studsvik, who's been doing this for decades. They take old steam generators and they decontaminate them so that the steel can be reused and so on. That's what Bruce Power was planning to do. But then CNSC actually gave them the permit to do it, but there was so much opposition from various groups along the St. Lawrence River where it would have to be shipped that Bruce Power decided, no, we're not going to do it because everybody doesn't agree. So this is kind of silly, but that's what happens, and that's why those steam generators are still sitting in warehouses at the site.
So those are useful steam generators? Like if they were...
No. They're good. They're good for recycled steel. Well, metals.
Right, exactly.
That's where the nuclear industry is self-defeating, because that sends a message that, oh yeah, these people were right. This stuff was dangerous. We shouldn't be moving it. You just got to keep pushing and say, you know what? Yeah. Somebody tell us not to do it. For a nuclear operator to say, we're not going to do it now because you guys are right, in essence is what they're saying. It just wasn't the thing to do. Somebody else should have ordered them not to do it, right? Great. Which probably would have happened, but still, it's the whole perception of the thing. It's totally safe, folks. Really, it is. Well, I don't believe you. You're not going to do it, right? Somebody else makes that decision.
Interesting.
You can cut that out, by the way. I don't want to talk like this on.
I could, if you want me to, I will. Yeah. But
doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I'm old enough to be cynical now.
That's right. On to another topic. It's like every nuclear advocate likes to think of ways that, like, we're always finding new ways that nuclear plants can be used, and it's always fascinating to think that you can have these hybrid reactors where you can do more than one task, not just create electricity, but do other things. And like Diablo Canyon produces desalination, and our reactors produce isotopes for medical reasons. And I'm sure there's a bunch of others that have, I think in Europe, they have some of the heat is for district heating. Some of it is for pulp and paper mills. Apparently they use some of that heat. And what about the CANDU? Besides, we know we already did that.
Yeah, the Bruce Energy Center.
Tell me more.
Well, the Bruce Energy Center, I mentioned they ran the heavy water plant off the process steam coming out of Bruce A. But they also did district heating. They heated the entire site with spare steam from Bruce A.
I didn't know that.
They ran greenhouses. There are a whole pile of other things. But it eventually got killed during the that era in the 90s where we were following the path of Emery Lovins, and
Yeah. What was the Emery Lovins influence? What was the negative aspect?
The soft path stuff, we just need to do degrowth. We don't need all this energy. And then Ontario Hydro's, it was, what's his face? Maurice Strong.
Really?
He slashed the funding for Ontario Hydro and shut down Pickering A and Bruce A and ran the whole.
So it was largely a philosophical difference then. Largely philosophical.
Absolutely. I mean, we went from Ontario Hydro's, the goal of Sir Adam Beck, abundant electricity at cost, right? Which is the foundation of modern society, to this idea that society was too big and we had to shrink everything and we had to, curtail our use of resources and, all live like Lovins. And that hosed Ontario Hydro. So
fascinating.
But so we did do all of that stuff at Bruce. We just stopped doing it when that.
So we're kind of like old hippies, but no, I mean
we are. But you got to remember, though, Rick, is there's several ways that you can multi-purpose a nuclear plant. You could have it feeding a bunch of batteries if there's a surplus. And I think Bruce actually does have batteries there now, or they plan to install some batteries in there on site so they can avoid some of the steaming process. But you can use the steam directly, which was what we were just talking about, or the district heating. Yeah. But then there's different qualities of steam that you require for different processes. Most industrial processes require steam that's so much hotter than what a CANDU produces, or a nuclear unit for that matter, even the other ones. That's why you have some of these specialized SMRs. They're talking about the high temperature process heat. And the other way you can repurpose it or multitask it is, like I just said, a battery on site. But that battery on site is no different than the battery in downtown Toronto that Bruce feeds through the transmission system, right? It just happens to be geographically close to there. And now you have the thing where 9 Mile Point in New York is producing hydrogen on site. Well, it's a 1 megawatt electrolyzer, right? They're taking a megawatt from the plant output and using it locally in an electrolyzer, and everybody thinks this is fantastic. In the meantime, that 1 megawatt could have backed off a megawatt of gas generation in New York. So what are you really doing with it? When you think about a dispatcher, in a dispatcher's mind, you always have to think, where's the next megawatt coming from? And if you take this megawatt away, what do you do to replace it, right? And like in New York, it's a gas generator down in New York City that came up an extra megawatt to run that electrolyzer at 9 Mile Point. It's not being run by nuclear.
Electrolyzer meaning it produces hydrogen? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And what do they do with the hydrogen?
And I don't know.
Oh, okay. Lots of things.
I had an idea back in the 90s when we were doing all the maneuvering, was that we should build a hydrogen plant right next door to Lennox and run the electrolyzers overnight because it's right on Lake Ontario, produce a whole bunch of hydrogen, and during the day when you need some peak generation, you run the Lennox units and hydrogen over peak during the day. But that's with excess.
So yeah,
you're
excess.
Taking that away where you can use it somewhere else. You got to think to yourself, okay, I've taken it away from that use. What's the actual impact of doing this, right? So the CANDU bottom line is, I had a fellow tell me this a long time ago, and I sort of had it corroborated on Twitter. Is they run like wet soup. Their steam is like just soup, right? Because it's not high pressure steam; it's low temperature, low pressure steam. That's why these generators have 3 massive low pressure turbines to get the energy out of the steam.
So what's your point?
Which is bigger than a normal high pressure.
I'm not sure I get the analogy. Soup is good or bad?
Well, if you want to use it for industrial processes, it's bad.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because it's not hot enough, right? It's just soup. It's not boiling water. It's just soup.
It's less than boiling. I see what you're saying.
But
it's ready to.
But I have the concept, and of course, people wouldn't like that. Is if you really need a lot of it, you build a hybrid plant, which is a nuclear provides the feed steam to a fossil process that takes it up the last little bit of temperature and pressure that you need for the process. You can build hybrids like that. And actually in the 50s, I think there was a plant or two where there was actually a fossil unit linked with a nuclear unit.
So
to do this kind of thing.
I mean, in some obscure way, hydrogen is fossil in the sense that it's burned. So is there the idea that you don't have to transport it makes it more appealing. But what about the actual burning of hydrogen? Is that a good source of energy?
It's not really fossil.
It's not fossil because it's not
fossil energy is something you dug out of the ground.
No, I meant in the sense that it's burned.
Well, it's burned, but it burns clean, right?
Absolutely, that's why it's good. But my point is that is it an efficient burner? Does it produce enough electricity?
No. It's the worst energy storage system of anything. That's really what you're doing, is you're using it for energy storage. The losses in that process of turning it back around, I don't know the exact numbers. It's probably under a 25% return, maybe even under 20%. Yeah, right? Whereas a battery gives you 85%, a good pump storage will give you 75 to 80%. If you have like what we have here in Ontario, which is a hybrid pump storage at Beck, we have a pump storage plant that takes water out of the canal that feeds the generating station right there. You're actually pumping that little bit of energy into the lake, but you're also reducing the main plant that much more. And like the pump cycle for the PGS at Beck, because it's a hybrid between the actual pump storage plant and the generating plant, was upwards of 90 to 95% efficiency on that.
You know what?
Like, it's really great. It still boggles my mind that it doesn't get used. I don't understand it. It's a market thing. I don't understand.
You could. I'm not a hydrogen fan myself, but just to be sure, hydrogen can be used in fuel cells, which are quite efficient. So it depends. You don't necessarily have to burn it. You can run it through fuel cells.
Okay, and that's interesting. And if the fuel cell is not in a car, is that useful? Like a fuel cell used in a different way for other purposes. Is that practical?
Sure.
Pardon me? Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess I just wanted to settle the argument that that hydrogen leaks and mixes into the atmosphere, and if it mixes with methane, the methane stays in the atmosphere longer. Have you heard that one? That's news to me. I found that from a guy in Ontario. His name is Paul Martin, and he's a hydrogen specialist. And he said when hydrogen leaks into the atmosphere, it'll mix with the existing methane, and the methane becomes even worse than it was in the first place, and it lasts an extra 30, 40 years in the atmosphere. And So in he's saying that hydrogen, when it leaks, is like is like a fossil fuel in that sense, because it causes the other greenhouse gases to last even longer. Have you heard that one? Is that news to you guys?
No, I think there must be some misunderstanding because it doesn't work that way. Hydrogen does not react with methane.
Really? This guy is calls himself a specialist. He has a company called Spitfire Research, and we should look that up and maybe talk about it another day. But okay, well, I think we had quite a good discussion. So let's see if there's any some of the things we might have left untouched.
Well, just to get back to Tom's one point there that he mentioned pumped storage, and he mentioned storage at Bruce. The Meaford project, which is now called Ontario Pumped Storage, and still hasn't started construction, but that was Bruce's answer to dumping steam overnight. They were trying to get away from curtailing. And in the immediate future, if we do refurbish Pickering B, which it looks like almost definitely going to happen at this point, we will have overnight surpluses. It's going to happen. We're going to have more reliable units with less downtime. So we're going to have more surplus capacity. So using that surplus to pump water out of Georgian Bay and then using it to offset some peaking capacity during the day, I think does make sense. It's the economics of it that may not.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that our public knows what pumped storage is. So you're talking about taking water from a lake and somehow storing it somewhere.
Yeah, the plan is to build a huge reservoir above Georgian Bay and then pump water out of Georgian Bay into it during the night and then use it to displace peaking gas during the day.
That's near Owen Sound, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Meaford.
Yeah, Meaford.
It's pretty harmless. I mean, you build a storage tank. It's not very...
it's very big.
It's big, but potentially dangerous, I suppose.
Yeah, limited. I mean, there's Raccoon Mountain in the States, which is absolutely massive, and it's much larger than Meaford. I think that's
dangerous.
A TVA project. Pardon, Tom?
They're not dangerous
because they're controllable.
You'd think people who are against it think it's the end of the world. But I saw the plans for this Meaford pump storage, and getting back to like the discharge water diffusers for Darlington, it makes them look pretty chintzy compared to what they were going to do at this pump storage, where they have the diffusers down in the lake. It won't even suck a fish into it. That's how diffused it's going to be, right? And we're talking 1,000 megawatt pump.
Yeah.
And
the flow is going to be so low that not even a fish is going to be captured by it. Wow. So they've got the stuff figured out pretty good.
Yeah.
Energy in versus energy out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a Rube Goldberg when you're comparing it to like pump storage, what we just talked about, which is 85% efficient.
Right.
Yeah.
Tom, anything you want to say to finish? Any comments before we go?
Well, in your notes, you had one thing about the CANDU units is what the steam temperatures were, and I had looked them up.
Oh, yeah.
And this is for a CANDU 6, but I think it applies to Bruce and Darlington as well. Pickering was 297 degrees C is the steam coming out of the reactor.
Okay.
Or the heavy water, the heat transport.
Sure.
CANDU 6 and the Bruce and Darlington, they run at 310 degrees Celsius. And then that goes through the steam generator, and the steam that gets sent out to the turbines, which is light water, demineralized light water, just like a normal conventional plant, is 260 degrees C. And the pressure on it, I didn't write that down, but it's about... The temperature and pressure are well below what you have in like a conventional fossil plant.
Right. So the process,
and that's what makes it
limited.
That's what makes it unusable for processing for industrial uses.
Okay, Jaro, any closing remarks?
Unless there's a question or something, did we miss something?
Yeah. have you enjoyed this? I see you smiling a lot. I got the impression that this is kind of refreshing to have this level of depth. And
you mentioned Canadians for Nuclear Energy, right?
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I do participate in the Facebook group, but not really otherwise.
All right. And Chris, what do you have for a closer? Anything?
The immortal CANDU. So that was another one of Mark Nelson's points.
That's up to that.
Yeah. So the thing, eventually your pressure vessel does wear out, right? So that kills your unit. You're done. That's it. You can replace the pressure tubes multiple times. So, and I think, I'm not 100% sure, right? I can't predict the future, but I do think that we will see pressure tubes being replaced at Bruce units 1 and 2 again. I think they'll be refurbished a second time.
Okay, yeah.
They're going to be out of step with the rest of the plant. So I think you'll see a subsequent refurbishment of those 2 units. And that opens the door for doing Darlington as well.
So the steam generators that are sitting there that need to be thrown out are recycled, whatever. That's one of the things that you would replace to make it immortal.
Yeah, I mean those are modules, right? You can replace them. They may not need being replaced when the pressure tubes need to be replaced again. The updated boilers should last longer, and they've got a better handle on keeping contamination out of the boilers and extending their lives. So a lot has improved in both their manufacture and maintenance since those ones that have now been removed and replaced have been installed. So I guess we'll see. Those units are supposed to be end of life like 2045. They probably won't.
So at the end of life of a pressure tube, where does it go?
Well, I think at Bruce they just go in the same warehouse as the steam generators at this point.
Eventually, some turtle is going to get one of those up its nose, and they're going to have to do something with it.
But not to a DGR. That's what would they go to a DGR?
Actually,
no, they're not.
Rick, yes, those pressure tubes from Bruce Refurb, they were supposed to go on OPG's DGR at the site. The one that was being planned, what was that, around 2015, something like that.
Okay,
but that DGR was...
That was the intermediate waste DGR, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was never built, so I think they just sit in a warehouse.
Yeah. Another point to note with this eternal life for the CANDU is the calandria.
Yep.
It's not exposed to like the high temperatures or the high radioactivity. It's more or less just a pressure tube holder or fuel channel holder.
Yep.
And the moderator in the calandria runs at about 70 degrees C, so it's not even running hot.
Oh, wow.
Yep. And it's not pressurized.
It's pretty cool.
So they have a long life, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how long does a stainless pot last?
Yeah.
Right?
Good point.
Forever.
Yeah.
Might as well just stay forever. So
I like that. Okay, well, okay, guys. So thanks very much. Appreciate it, and we're bound to have some other future meeting. We can find a reason, I'm sure, and so I look forward to it, and I will keep you guys posted when I get this published. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'll catch you later. So have a good day, and we'll be in touch soon.
All right, guys.
Okay. Bye.
All right. See you later.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.